right, good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for taking the time for joining us for PQMD's Pillar Talk, long-term strategies to support disaster recovery, multi-sector perspectives, a part of a large series of webinars which the PQMD community of practice offers to address major trends, leading thinking, best practices, and provocative issues in global health. I'm Elizabeth Ashbourne, also known as EJ. I'm PQMD's Executive Director, and I want to welcome you on behalf of our entire team. For those of you who are not familiar with PQMD, we are a global alliance of international NGOs and leading healthcare companies committed to advancing the role of product donations worldwide. Founded in 1999, our work is guided by 5 pillars: humanitarian assistance, health system strengthening, disaster response preparedness, guidelines, and knowledge management. Today, the work of our members is central to the global response to universal healthcare by promoting sustainable access to quality healthcare in underserved communities and displaced populations in crisis. So very quickly, I want to review some housekeeping rules. Please go ahead and warm up your fingers. Please type your name in the chat box and let us know your organization as well. While we request all participants remain muted, we do invite you to use the chat box for questions and comments, and you can do that throughout the session. This session is being recorded and will be posted on PQMD's Community of Practice this week. If you haven't already signed up for the Community of Practice, you can do that through cop.pqmd.org, and we will send something out to help you with that as well. And I will share the link. The link will be shared on the in the chat box. So please join and keep up to date on informative discussions with our members and partners as well. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Kavitha Sood Isaacs, who will be our moderator for this session. While I'm introducing Kavitha, I'm going to put up a graphic that we have developed to use for today's discussion. So Kavitha is the Senior Manager of Global Community Relations at Baxter International. In this role, she supports Baxter's mission to save and sustain lives through the management of Baxter International Foundation's signature partnerships, product donations, and employee volunteerism and giving initiatives. We here at PQMD are also lucky to have Kavitha's leadership and expertise at the helm of our Disaster Response and Humanitarian Relief Committee. So without further ado, we are pleased to bring you this conversation between multi-sector and I say rock star disaster experts. Thanks, Kavitha, for your support and for your leadership. And now over to you.
Great. Thank you, EJ. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As EJ said, I'm Kavitha Sood Isaacs, Chair of PQMD's Disaster Relief and Humanitarian Assistance Committee and Senior Manager for Global Community Relations at Baxter International, where I have the opportunity to lead our disaster relief and product donation efforts. I'm honored to be joined by my fellow panelists today to discuss the 4 different phases of disaster recovery and specifically spotlight the 4th phase. This conversation is timely as September was Disaster Preparedness Month at PQMD. And I want to acknowledge the number of natural disasters we have seen in the last few weeks alone. Hurricanes Fiona and Ian in the Atlantic, typhoons across Japan and Asia, flooding in Pakistan, wildfires in the west coast of the United States, earthquakes in Mexico, just to name a few. Natural disasters and disaster relief intersect with so many critical issues that disproportionately impact the underserved, from climate change, mental health, and universal healthcare to supply chain and resource constraints. These are cross-cutting themes that could be built into Pillar Talks 2, 3, and 4. However, today, we are going to drill down into what happens when the cameras go away. How can we support communities in need, not just in the immediate aftermath of a storm, wildfire, or hurricane, but long after the news cycle has ended and the media has left? What approaches do we take to the 4th phase of disaster relief efforts, recovery, after we've invested in the 3 prior stages of mitigation, preparation, and response? As a part of this discussion, we're going to look at how cash and product donations provide support for communities and how partnerships, such as the ones built through the PQMD network, can inform long-term strategies and create lasting change. The disaster relief infographic that's been presented here is a new tool developed by our committee to provide an overview of each stage of disaster response and the critical activities and considerations for each, with a special lens on product donations. For the recovery phase in particular, some of our considerations are the delivery of products and services to address chronic and long-term treatment needs, strategic ongoing shipments through existing partnerships and program infrastructure, as well as cash and other support to assist affected populations in their efforts to build back health systems. Baxter, for example, looks to provide support across the spectrum of the 4 disaster relief stages. We deploy a preparedness strategy through both cash investments from the Baxter International Foundation, as well as a manufacture to donate product program, where we donate and manufacture products twice a year to pre-position in times of need. Additionally, we respond in the immediate aftermath of a disaster with critical surge support. And in the recovery phase, we look to collaborate with partners on programs that enhance healthcare infrastructure and delivery in our key strategic priority areas of diabetes prevention, nutrition, and WASH, or water, sanitation, and hygiene. Now that I've set the stage, I want to briefly introduce our panelists as you have their full bios. Joining me today from the corporate sector is Kim Keller from the Global Community Impact Team at Johnson & Johnson, where she leads disaster response, resilience, and product donations. From the U.S. government perspective, we're joined by Anna Taylor, Operational Readiness Branch Chief from the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration at FEMA, which essentially means she connects private sector partners through the various FEMA offices. And last but not least, we have our NGO perspective from Betsy Warfield, Interim Vice President of Emergency Programs at AmeriCares. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today and lending your expertise. To get us started, I'd like to pose our first question. Betsy, I'll start with you. As I noted in my opening remarks, one of the bedrocks of PQMD is partnerships, trusted partnerships. How do you collaborate with partners, both in your sector and cross-sector, to take a long-term strategic approach to disaster recovery efforts?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. So from day one of a response, AmeriCares is constantly collaborating with our ongoing partners and the coordination mechanisms for the response. So this will include our partners such as the local ministry or departments of health, health facilities and ongoing clinics, other organizations, the cluster system, emergency operations centers, or the emergency medical teams coordination cell. And when we are completing our assessments and working on our response plans, we're also thinking and discussing what long-term response and recovery could look like and will look like. Often we have a good sense of this from our partner needs and any current or ongoing programming we have in the affected area, and we're able to start working toward recovery and resilience during the acute response phase.
Thank you, Betsy. Anna, I'll pose the same question to you. Can you share a bit more about how you collaborate with partners in sector and cross sectors?
Thank you, Kavitha. So our particular office within FEMA, the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration, serves FEMA to support robust, better, more relevant planning, response, and recovery efforts. We do this through continuous engagement and partnership with the public-private sector. We work with all FEMA components to coordinate quality engagements with the public and private sector stakeholders by working with our fellow FEMA components to assess their needs as they relate to the private sector, and then bringing them in contact with private sector partners to assess the capabilities and capacity to work in a mutually beneficial manner. By doing this, it allows us to fully understand what the private sector is capable of and what they can bring to disaster response and recovery. This can be for long-term strategy, bringing together the partners to provide input into FEMA strategic plan, to bring together hoteliers to those that administer FEMA's transitional sheltering assistance program, or working with grocery providers on ways to share data on store operations to measure community recovery following a disaster. All of these strengthen our ability to help communities respond and recover following a disaster.
Thank you, Anna. Speaking of the private sector response, Kim, could you share a bit about how you collaborate with your partners?
I sure can. Thanks, Kavita, and thanks for moderating this call for us all today. As part of the Johnson & Johnson Sustainable Development Goals commitment, we've recognized that we must partner. Goal 17 speaks to strengthening the means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. Nowhere, as my fellow speakers have said, is this more important than in disaster response, with a key piece being trust, and you mentioned that, Kavita. You can't build a trusted partnership on the spot. It takes work. However, that work allows pre-positioned product to be ready for disasters before they hit. It also facilitates ongoing support in critically impacted communities, even between and before and again after disasters when they hit the same place. It also yields open, honest, and speedy response and a give and take of information to better focus support on the ground. So we're so pleased that we have this type of partnership with many of the PQMD members on the call today, as well as with FEMA from different parts of our business, all working together for betterment of the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I'm glad that you mentioned the UN SDGs as a part of the work that we're doing here, fits in with a larger global context. Kim, I'd like to stay with you and ask you a question in terms of, the infographic we presented earlier. Product donations as well as cash are both critical in all 4 phases of disaster response effort. Can you speak to the role product donations and cash efforts play for J&J specifically in the 4th stage of recovery? Oh, Kim, you're on mute.
I forgot. Thank you. We should all know better than that by this point, shouldn't we?
It happened.
J&J has a long history of engagement and support of crises, starting with our first documented philanthropic giving in 1898 in support of the Spanish-American War. That was with product. So our first phase of response is always with product. Since then, we've responded to earthquakes, floods, fires, cyclones, hurricanes, tsunamis, pandemics around the globe. As a healthcare company, our focus is always on some aspect of health, and our response is guided to places with or without an employee presence, where we have active partners and can offer something that is in support of those in need. As I mentioned, our initial response is always product. It's pre-positioned with our partners. This may change as we move forward with Johnson & Johnson, as we branch out with our consumer products into a new company called Kenvue. And we won't have access to that, but our focus is still on products, medical device, pharmaceutical products. The goal there is to meet the gap in coverage with the devastation of the disaster, cutting off access, cutting off healthcare processes, closing pharmacies, etc. We also support with cash at the initial phase, the partners who are working with our product, who are sending the product, who are shipping their personnel and their mobile medical units and other supplies and operational staff to meet the needs of the communities that are impacted. As the crisis becomes clear in the midterm response phase, we work with partners to provide specifically needed products to continue to fill those gaps. And depending on the level of crisis, those products will change from the consumer products to the long-term pharma meds, again, with pharmacies being closed, to crush injuries and medical device products of sutures and trauma kits that are needed to help people recover after they've been pulled from the crisis zone. At this time, we're also able to provide cash to meet some immediate needs which are faced by local clinics and their providers as they serve impacted communities. We don't do reconstruction from a physical infrastructure perspective, but if a clinic's going to shut down because they don't have gas to run the generator, to run the refrigerator in order to provide the meds, then we're going to support them as we can with fuel. In the extended crisis situations, we also work to develop long-term, up to 3 to 5 year partnerships and programs to help the impacted communities return to baseline. I say return to baseline because what is normal? We can't talk about normal. So just return to baseline before the crisis. In this phase, we look back to our strategy focus areas around nurses, community health workers, and midwives, thinking about their resiliency and mental health. But we don't just focus on those guys. We also look at the communities. We like to find vulnerable communities who are the most impacted and likely the least being served by all, thinking about their needs, and programming for them at times of areas which the focus needs. And in COVID, we saw that this was in transition because we're still working with COVID. We're still working on meeting vulnerable needs from COVID, and that just impacts the crisis as we move forward. So I think we cover all of the sectors there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. You're touching on one of those cross-cutting topics, which could be an entire another conversation about long-term humanitarian settings and the impact of COVID and the double consequences of these in immediate disaster response. So thank you. Betsy, I want to move to you in terms of talking about your role as a global disaster relief and health organization that focuses on serving underserved communities. How do your immediate disaster response plans inform your long-term recovery programming? And how do you ensure that resources are still available after the camera's gone away?
Yes, great question. And oftentimes we're responding to locations where we've responded before or have ongoing partners. So during our acute phases, we're able to turn the longer programmatic initiatives to support ongoing gift in kind or capacity building, such as healthcare worker resilience training during the response, and then to our partners and old and new partners ongoing after we switch into the recovery phase. We continue to share and gather metrics and inform our outcomes, share those with our donors, share them with other partners to kind of work and see what we're able to add into the recovery work and find additional resources as we're able to fold them in. Oftentimes there's not additional funding that comes in after the acute phase, but this does allow us to maybe better target if we have certain things we want to achieve, or when there is a large gap or a need still missing in that area, we're able to, really push to get that funding and be able to do that programming or provide that support to our partners or the local community. And I would just say that in our existing programming, we often have additional resources. So a lot of times our acute phase will transition into ongoing programming, and our local teams or our international or US teams will take on that work because they're able to fold it into our ongoing programmatic work that relates back to our mission. We're able to continue to kind of meet those partner needs and also add them into a longer term support mechanism through their work with us.
Thanks, Betsy. Just one follow-up question for you. Could you share a bit about a geographic area or situation where those long-term programmatic efforts or immediate disaster response have kind of converged and carried on to provide support for a community?
Yeah, great question. We have quite a few examples I think that I could give. I know for just current times, Hurricane Ian has impacted Florida again, and we have over 200 partners in that area of where the path of the storm went this year. And they've been continually affected by storms in the past. So we were able to preemptively reach out to a lot of our partners before the storm hit, make sure that they were okay, that they knew that we were here if they needed anything. And we're providing our support to them now post disaster, and we'll continue to do so as we kind of continue on with recovery, but also our acute phase of the response efforts. Another example would be the Philippines. Our team in the Philippines came about because of our response to Typhoon Haiyan. And so we were able to stay in the country and really grow our programmatic work, which has, I think, grown about tenfold now from the disaster response and the acute phase into now ongoing MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support training. We do disaster risk reduction. A big component of recovery is also your readiness and your resilience training. So we are able to provide that to the communities and our partners. We also have water, sanitation, and hygiene programming, all which then folds back into how we respond and our response intervention. So we are able to see that full circle through the work of our Philippines team and all of our teams in every location.
Thank you, Betsy. I think that's a great example of investing in a community from a disaster perspective and then staying to build infrastructure long-term to ensure continuity. And as you mentioned, readiness and resiliency are critical parts of preparedness for the next natural disaster. And I'd love to turn to you now. Could you share how FEMA determines how long it will stay in a community after a disaster to support recovery efforts? And can you share examples of how recovery initiatives may help inform parts of the disaster response cycle in the future?
So thank you, Kavitha. That's a great question. So you'll hear it said that FEMA will stay until the job is done, but of course it's more complicated than that. FEMA immediately responds with our incident management assistance teams. They set up the initial operating facility, which becomes the joint field office where FEMA and the state typically work out of together to work on disaster response. Once the state and FEMA have agreed that the response needs have been met, they'll transition to the long-term recovery office, and the JFO will either shut down or transition to that long-term recovery office, depending on the scale of the disaster. That long-term recovery office can be there for months or a couple of years. It depends on the needs that came out of that disaster. FEMA also has a robust grant program to address some of those longer term recovery needs. They're based on hazard mitigation. There's the BRIC program. All of it has to do with what are the needs that have arisen in communities following a disaster. And they're meant to address generally more vulnerable communities and what has occurred in those communities, but also to ensure that those communities can come back in ways that the future disasters will not affect them in the same way. The goal is that the next time another hurricane comes along, that it will not take out the same infrastructure in the same way. We don't want the next hurricane to take out the same power grid, or at least that power grid can endure more, or the homes are built stronger and better when they're rebuilt. And that's the goal of our long-term recovery plans. So how long we stay in a community, it depends on the disaster that happened. For smaller disasters, long-term recovery tends to move out pretty quickly, but for something as large as Ian, we may be there for quite a while. So the answer is really, it depends.
Absolutely.
What I can say though is FEMA's BRIC program, which launched in 2020, as a grant program that's dedicated to providing states, local communities, tribes, and territories with funding that will make a long-term difference before disasters occurs. It's one of the 5 pre-disaster mitigation grants or grant subcategories. And I can provide information in the chat on grant, on the BRIC program and the hazard mitigation grant program. And both of these are amazing programs that FEMA offers to help communities that have either had historical disasters or are trying to ensure that before disasters hit, that they are prepared and ready for them.
Thanks, Anna. I think you're highlighting an important note, which is while we talk about 4 distinct stages of disaster recovery, it's impossible to really separate them from immediate response efforts to investments in future recovery. And from our prior conversation, the example you shared stuck out to me about Hurricane Michael in terms of housing. Could you share a little bit more about that with the group?
Yes. So FEMA has worked with, and it's not just actually Michael, we also did it with Mississippi and Louisiana, on putting forward some, with the states in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida on the post-building codes following the disasters, on the codes for building back the homes in the areas that were affected. So in Mexico Beach, the homes along the Mississippi coast, some of the homes along the Louisiana coast, to be more hurricane resistant. I know down in Mississippi, there are now laws in place about building the homes on poles or risers so that the hurricane floodwaters will go under the homes and they won't be swept away. I'm not sure on the exact codes in Mexico Beach, but I know there are definitely requirements for being stronger against hurricanes. I responded down in to Michael, and the devastation there was, I don't actually have words for it. But if the houses can be built back stronger, and this is what we mean by build back better, if we can build them back stronger, then the next hurricane damage should be less catastrophic.
Thanks, Anna. It is difficult working in these settings, as you all know. I think one of the related things, Betsy, that I want to ask you about, particularly with COVID, but as you know from the impact of any natural disaster or humanitarian setting, is that mental health seems to have entered in the mainstream lexicon and dialogue. So I want to ask, have you noticed any shifts in how your organization supports mental health for those who are dealing with the trauma and impact in the aftermath of disaster months and often years later, and often into the next time around?
Yeah, that's a great question. And mental health is one of our, main pillars of support that we want to provide as an organization. And it's definitely key to health. And so we really have built a lot of programming and training around the different mental health components for both resilient healthcare workers, but also clinics and patient-facing training. I think in the recovery phase, it's really a big piece of what we do on ongoing support, whether that is, in the acute phase, it's more of the quick surge capacity, really helping the frontline workers and the clinic staff to be able to, exhibit really great PFA, but also, not re-traumatize individuals when they come into their clinic to seek help or, more support, and being able to really receive that and provide them the best support they can, but also, their own burnout and how they handle things and what that looks like. And then longer term in the recovery phase is really, how is the community doing? How are they able to build back with their mental health? And how does that have, because it has downstream effects on everything else that happens. And, what does that look like from a long-term investment back into that community to make sure that they are being more resilient for the next time, but also better prepared, and they know they've learned the skills of how to receive things and how to process their different trauma and their feelings. And when you live in disaster prone areas and it continues to happen, you're oftentimes re-traumatized every single time a new disaster comes through. We just saw that with Fiona. It, hit almost to the day 5 years later from Hurricane Maria, which was another reminder to everyone in Puerto Rico of what they went through 5 years prior. And so it brings up a lot, and it's a huge piece of really trying to support the community and allowing them to, get back to that baseline, as Kim said. I think that's a great way to put it. Where can they go? But hopefully we're able to provide a little bit more support or training to the community healthcare workers to really get them beyond that baseline and not have them have to dip below it, or, really be able to support them longer term. We have a lot of ongoing programming. So for the recovery piece, it's great for us to be able to fold that in with our mental health support. And that does look like a lot of capacity building and training, but also, a little bit of the preparedness for the next time it happens, and having community healthcare workers or, health facilities really build up that capacity to be able to respond and to be able to maybe preemptively respond a little bit too, to kind of set the stage to almost kind of help save some of the mental health that they can. But it's you never really know what's going to happen and how it's going to fold out, but just being able to recognize it, have a great plan of how to help support it and kind of build it up as you kind of move through the recovery phase is crucial.
Thank you, Betsy. And as we've talked about before, building it into your programmatic work in a comprehensive way really helps, because it's not as tangible as some of the other needs in immediate aftermath, as such as shelter or providing a meal, but it's just as critical, if not more important, to address. So really building a holistic program helps support that as well. Thank you. Kim, I want to go to you for a question on investments. Financially, how would you advise a donor to invest in the recovery phase versus another seemingly equally important phase of the disaster response cycle?
Thanks, Kavitha. As a corporate donor, I think it depends. It depends on what story you want to tell. If your story that you want to tell is, as a donor is, we were there to support a disaster, then, give to AmeriCares or one of the other partners on the phone, to their disaster response fund. And you've done it at the beginning of the year with your limited budget, and you've been able to be successful and you are able to help. If you have the ability and the desire to be more directive in your impact, and you are not as concerned about the visibility of the donation, which is one of the reasons this phase is always so difficult, is the resiliency phase. Waiting until the press is gone, understanding what you can do to really impact that community. As you mentioned, as Anna mentioned, a lot of the focus on Build Back Better is physical infrastructure, but the mental health needs are just as important. Making connections between the vulnerable communities the communities rely on the health center relies on the health center. They don't have any connections anywhere else. How do you build them into the larger infrastructure? Making sure that they're part of the national plan for health for their community and that they're not forgotten and that they have paid staff who's willing and able to stay and has their own resiliency to continue to treat their populations when they've been personally impacted. These are very important areas that don't always get the funding focus, that don't always get the press, because it is a little more silent, Kavitha, like you mentioned. It's harder to put metrics around. How is giving money to help people become more mentally health resilient really actually making them better next time? You can easily determine if you make somebody's house stronger and they can support they can survive the next hurricane, they're stronger. But if they're breaking through the mental stress, building them a stronger house isn't going to help. So that would be, I think my thing is to really push trying to get out of the news cycle and really understand what's needed, and work directly with those local communities to support that in the resiliency phase.
Thanks, Kim. You hit on what I'd like to ask Anna next. And could you speak a bit to how you use data and metrics in a disaster response setting to inform future recovery efforts?
So Kavitha, that's actually been kind of my life for the last week. We've been, of course, pretty deep into the response for Hurricane Ian, and a lot of what we've been doing right now is pulling the data and metrics. So it's trying to find out where the affected communities are, pulling the social vulnerability index. A lot of times it's not going to help us if we are sending all of the resources to communities that are going to be able to recover on their own just fine. We need to look to see which communities are going to need the assistance of FEMA or the state, and making sure that that recovery assistance is getting there, whether it is the food, water, shelter, mental health resources through our National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. If I refer to them as NVOAD, you'll understand why. It's a very long organization name. But we want to make sure that everything that we are offering through our organization or through the state or the community is getting to those that actually need it. So we use that metric data to figure out where those populations are and then target those resources to those populations that are most in need. Communities that have the resources already, where the grocery stores are open, the pharmacies are fine, the power came back, and they have the resources to get these things for themselves. They had the money to evacuate. They're not going to need as much, but a lot of communities, they weren't able to. And so that is what we a lot of times use the metrics for and use the data. And then for the longer term, we work with the state to figure out what they're going to need for 6 months, for a year, 18 months going forward. So as FEMA starts pulling back our logistics supplies, who's going to need to come in and fill the gaps? Because there will be gaps. And is it going to be volunteer organizations? Is it going to be state resources, whether it's through WIC or Medicare or Medicaid? And we will work with the state on that.
Thank you. I want to go to one more round robin of questions before we open it up for Q&A. And I know some of you have touched upon these different aspects, but what part of the recovery phase is most forgotten or least prioritized? And do you have any suggestions for how we can shine a brighter light and bring attention to these solutions and long-term challenges? Betsy, can we start with you?
Yeah, I think we've highlighted mental health a little bit already, and I might take a little bit different of an avenue right now, but I think one thing, is often in the acute phase, there is a lot of funding, there's a lot of organizations or communities that are ready to help and provide that help, but it only gets so far, and most of the time it doesn't get everyone back over the total finish line. You're not completely back to where you should be, or in a better state, or set up better for the next time. And that gap in between when that acute phase support and the recovery efforts that take oftentimes years to really truly recover from a disaster, there's a large gap there of funds, product that's needed. We have a lot of ongoing clinic partners where we provide gift in kind, but that only does a drop in the bucket to maybe what they need post disaster if they aren't able to get everything back up and running. We do a lot of emergency funding, which also helps them maybe build back their roof, but similar to FEMA, like there's a lot more involved in that. FEMA's there for a long time too, because it takes a long time. And I think that gap and that runway in between when the acute push kind of ends and the recovery really starts, if there's no one that's able to really do the recovery, like it's really on the community and the individuals themselves to get them across that finish line, and it can take them even longer without additional support. And so we also use the metrics of like what existed here before, what is like, what's culturally appropriate for this part of the US or part of the world, and like how are we building that into the recovery plan to make sure we're not getting them to somewhere that they can't sustain themselves either, right? So like, how are you building that kind of as a full package, and really making sure that it carries itself out in the appropriate time that it needs? Because we don't really ever know what that is. Like it could be years, it could be months, it could be years, but making sure that it is happening and kind of continuing to recover.
Thank you. Anna, how about you? Could you share your thoughts on how we can continue to focus on these important recovery efforts?
So I know, we have that initial response push, and about 3 to 6 months down the line, we fall out of the media cycle. And I know FEMA's down there still working, but the communication starts breaking down. And it becomes a little harder. We're down there, we're working in the communities, but I'm not sure everybody recognizes the work that's still being done. And it can be really hard sometimes to get all of the needed resources. I know it's food, water, shelter, very important. But I'm definitely with Kim. The mental health piece is overlooked a lot of times. There is trauma that happens, and it happens to the responders too. But if the responders are getting trauma, I can't even imagine what it's like for those in the affected communities. So that's a giant gap right now. And it's being left to the members of the volunteer organizations. Where I think the hardest part of the recovery right now is that time about 6 to 8 months down the road, as we're trying to figure what's next for these communities that went through such a traumatic incident, and they may have a roof back over their head, but how do you rebuild your community?
Absolutely. And I'll add from my perspective, I think the ongoing updates and data and reports that we receive from our partners in the aftermath of a natural disaster are really important for our ability to be able to communicate to employees, right? And again, when there is no urgent news setting, everyone moves on to the next, while these situations and communities continue to rebuild. So that importance of communication is something that we think about as well. And, our responsibility to continue to share updates and needs, so that even individual donors and supporters can continue to make investments where they're needed. I know I've seen questions popping up in the chat, so I think with that I might turn it over to Victoria to ask some of our Q&A and guide us through.
Thank you. Thanks, Kavita. Thanks, everybody. It's been a really interesting discussion so far. I can't wait to get more from you as we ask these great questions that have come in. So I'll start with Liam, who I believe is from Brothers Foundation. Says, thank you to all the panelists. How do your organizations incorporate DEI practices into recovery and preparedness efforts? Any takers?
I'll jump in. And the answer is we really don't. However, we don't. I say that in that we really don't because we're focusing on vulnerable communities. And in most instances in disasters, those communities that are most negatively impacted are communities of color, especially in the US, or neglected communities around the globe, which are typically communities with much diversity in them. And we also look at not just, different races or things like that, but different vulnerable communities from HIV patients to LGBTQ to those sorts of pieces of the diversity inclusion, which are most often left out of the formal healthcare infrastructure, especially the focus areas when things like that happen. So it's not, and that's usually more at the longer term when we're starting to do cash and resilience funding, is looking at those types of vulnerable communities, also focusing in on the most local responders as possible who are in touch with those most vulnerable communities. We've worked with HIV patients, we've worked with migrant farm workers, we've worked with LGBTQ kids to try to support their engagement back in the process after disaster. So again, it's not specifically talking about DE&I, but it's just thinking about vulnerable communities who are mostly the DE&I areas. Hope that makes sense.
Great, Kim, thanks. Anna, Betsy?
Kavita, or Victoria, I'll jump in here. So equity is actually one of the pillars of our current strategic plan under Administrator Criswell. So it's definitely become something we're trying to focus on as we respond, recover from any disaster. It's part of everything, actually. All four of the phases you had up there, it's something we try and think about. And as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at the social vulnerability index, and DEI, I think, ties into that index. There's just no getting around it. We've been having conversations, I refer to it down on the floor, it's our National Response Coordination Center, about who are those affected populations. And it is unfortunately mostly populations of color, of people of color, also migrant workers right now for the orange farms have been disproportionately affected by Ian, and we're needing to consider, and a lot of those populations have a lack of government trust. And for some very valid reasons. So who do we send to have conversations with them about what's available to them for assistance right now? Because a lot of times if we show up with the FEMA logo on, the conversations may not happen. So who can we have to go and have the conversations about what's available for resources? These are all things we consider when we're going out for a response.
Great, thanks, Betsy.
Yeah, I'll just add a few things. So one of our main, goals is to provide equitable care. So we pull that into everything we do. And that's not only our direct patient care, but how we also work with our partners post-disaster and our ongoing partners in our programming efforts. I'd also add that all of our processes that we have put in place for how we recruit, we vet, we train our roster and our partners allows it to be an equitable experience. We give them all of the same materials and information. We've added a lot of pieces around protection and inclusion and safeguarding to ensure that we are providing the most equitable care and following through on that, not only with who we put in the field to support individuals and our partners post-disaster, but also for those recovery pieces. And I would also add that we, really have a focus during the assessments to understand with the Department of Health and our other partners what is expected there, kind of how things operate. You usually learn a lot about where different populations live within the community, what resources are available to them. And we're able to, really take that in an even playing field and make sure that they are getting the same attention and support that everyone else is getting, or that they deserve, because it is a human right to have health and to, have care post-disaster. And so we really kind of lay that over everything we do, but the assessments and the information we gather really helps inform that for us and really helps highlight where it is. I know in the past, we've been asked to hand over medical documents for our clinics to the departments of health, but it's because they wanted to know if there were any undocumented individuals or people that maybe shouldn't have been at those clinics. And we were able to de-identify that information before we handed it over to protect those identities and protect those individuals. And that is just something that we don't want to cause more stress or harm to the individuals living in that community. We just want to make sure that they have everything they need post-disaster and that they're able to, have a healthy life and continue to live where they are.
Great, thanks so much, Betsy, Kim, and Anna. Those were really, really great responses and really interesting. I'm gonna now read a question from Christina from Children International. She says, vulnerable children are often hurt first and worse during disasters. Do you include a child protection focus in your response work, or work with partners on that element of response and recovery?
I can jump in there first. Yes, thank you, Christina. That's really important. At Johnson & Johnson, one of our strategic partners is Save the Children. We also work with UNICEF, and both of those are child focused. We've done a lot of work with the safe spaces for children, that sort of thing. I'll also kind of reinforce something that Betsy had mentioned earlier about long-term support and long-term partnerships. We were introduced to a great partner in Puerto Rico called Atención after Hurricane Maria, and funded some work that they were doing around mental health and psychosocial support for kids, which impacts the parents in a positive way as well. We were able to, increase a little bit of funding during COVID to keep them going through that COVID period when everything was online and it was harder for them to reach out directly to the kids. And then we were able to provide additional funding after the earthquakes, because as Betsy noted, and then so did Anna, people consistently get impacted and consistently have the same trauma. And the older kids are seeing the same trauma in their younger siblings, and they're bringing them to the program and things. And we're looking to see how we might be able to increase that focus moving forward after Fiona. So kids are very important to J&J. We, have a big legacy of mom and baby, and we do try to include that work. And that does impact the parents as well, because making the kids safe and giving the kids something to do while the parents are having to deal with all the other chaos is a very important piece of recovery. Thank you for asking the question.
Betsy, please go ahead.
You can go ahead. I think we unmuted at the same time, so if you want to go first, you can.
So FEMA clearly with its mission doesn't get as much time to work directly with children. Most of that work is done through our National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster and our partnership with our volunteer organizations. Through InVOAD, I know Save the Children is one of the members of InVOAD. So that's how most of our work with children is done, is through those InVOAD memberships. A lot of the other organizations that are in InVOAD do direct work with children to ensure that their needs are being met after a disaster. Most of FEMA's focus is on initial response and recovery, making sure life-saving mission happens first, and then the community response and recovery is happening.
And I'll just add for us, so there's a couple ways that we do. I mean, we also work with Save the Children quite frequently in different locations, especially around safe women and children spaces. But for us, as part of our emergency medical teams package and kind of how we operate our medical teams, we've built in a structure for unaccompanied minors and how to take in those unaccompanied minors, ensure their safety, but also then, follow the proper referral and next steps for finding them the next place to go that is appropriate. We also have, companionship opportunities for, women and children who want to come in and have an accompany with them during their screening and things like that, to be able to provide that care for them. We do a little bit of MHPSS, children-focused activities post-disaster. Our Philippines team is one of the best carriers out of this in the Philippines. They do a whole activity with the children and kind of have them draw how they feel, and they do some songs and games to try to make them feel a little bit better, or like be able to talk about kind of what they're feeling and how they're doing. And then I would say with the children specifically, they are a big part of the family. So when you are supporting the family as a whole, you are providing that support to those children and kind of making sure that they have everything they need. And if their parents or their guardians are taken care of, you're kind of, letting that flow down to the children as well, to be able to be taken care of by their parents and guardians. And I think that's a big component of, the family health aspect, and really making the holistic picture of the individual when you are responding.
Great. That's really great to know. Really interesting information. I'm going to ask, I think, one more question from the audience and then turn it over to Kavita for one final round robin question. Ann Motz from BD and Baxter says, I am curious what the focus on resilient energy, solar, etc., looks like in terms of support from FEMA and AmeriCares. Is that factored into disaster preparedness, resiliency? It's such an important component. So, Anna, Betsy, thoughts?
So I know this is something that can be applied to as part of the BRIC program. I put the link in the chat earlier. So when applying for BRIC or hazard mitigation loans, it's something that can be factored in. And I know, let me pull it up here. I actually have an example of a initiative that was done. The city of Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, experienced two 500-year storm events in 2003 and 2004 that caused millions of dollars in damages to properties. In collaboration with FEMA and a hazard mitigation grant and the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, the city purchased and demolished 4 homes that experienced repetitive flooding losses. And the open space was left to build a 24,000 square foot municipal rain garden that receives drainage from 3.17 acres. And it can hold and filter up to 30,000 gallons of water. So it's an example of a way that a space that was getting repetitive damage was used, and to instead feed the city with water that was able to be used for city use. And programs like this are something that FEMA encourages through our resilience and hazard mitigation programs.
Great. Betsy, did you also want to respond?
Yes, and I apologize. It cut out a little bit on my end, so I didn't hear the full question. I'm not sure exactly which one it is, but I think it's the solar ongoing one. Okay. So we do this in quite a few ways. We have a couple of partnerships that we have that provide ongoing, like solar lanterns that we're able to ship to our partners post-disaster. As part of our emergency medical teams, we also are able to be fully self-sufficient. So to create potable water, which not only for our team, but also the community use, which is really able to kind of get us up and going and running and not be reliant on having those infrastructures back in place. And then we do a lot of ongoing programming, more so in the communities on, clean water practices, hygiene, and kind of that self-sufficiency and sustainability with water pumps and things like that we're able to add in either post-disaster or in a preparedness phase to kind of make sure that those are in place and hopefully not impacted by a disaster in the communities that we work on an ongoing basis.
And I know you didn't direct that to me, Kavita, but I just want to jump in and follow up something that Betsy and Anna both said is, one of the things we've talked about is the resilience phase and the building back better phase and the funding needs there. It's also a matter of engaging the communities and giving them some training and awareness of the things that are causing these crises, because they may not be as understanding of climate change depending on where in the world they are, all of that sort of thing, and how can we understand what their needs are. Do they feel like they have good water? They have the borehole, so that's not really the problem. So let's not worry about that. Let's focus on solar panels for the clinics, or, but you have to get their buy-in, because then they have to be trained to maintain and operate and own. And how can they make that a sustainable business practice for their community? Those are the new and interesting opportunities as we all look at, from a corporate perspective, or even an individual donor perspective, impact investing, or those sorts of things. These are some new, interesting ways of building resilience, engaging in community development, and long-term sustainability. So just wanted to throw those quick little nuggets out there.
Great, thanks everybody. And Kavita, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to close us out with a quick rapid fire question around the table. It's a big one, but I think it'd be great to get your insight. So we often hear that what breaks down in a disaster response can be the coordination, collaboration, or communication. So if you could change one thing in how to better work together across sectors, what would it be? I'll give you a second, and then maybe Anna, we can start with you.
I think, gosh, it is a big question. So I'll admit, I have the luxury of a giant room on my second floor of my building, where we literally bring in the volunteer organizations and 20 different government agencies to coordinate. So we have that luxury. That's one of the luxuries of being FEMA. What I would love to be able to do is be able to bring up our private sector partners on a call each day, and be able to sit down and, what's going on? Where are you? What is the status of your businesses? And be able to bring in groups like Johnson & Johnson and AmeriCares and the healthcare buddies of the world, and just be able to have daily situational awareness. And then as we go into the recovery phase, what do you need? What do you need to make sure that these communities are going to be okay, and not have people wander away from the table? Because people do. They start wandering away from the table once it's not the hot thing in the news anymore.
Yeah, that ongoing commitment. That's important. Kim, Betsy, any closing thoughts from you?
I'm just going to jump in real quick, Betsy, because I want to follow up on what Anna said. And Anna said it very nicely. What I wrote down on my notes was, we all just need to get over ourselves. It's all about the people that are on the ground that have been impacted. It's not the press, it's not the glory, it's not the money, it's not the fundraising, it's not the, we did this, aren't we great? It's how do we all work together? Like Anna said, get on a call, talk about it. I know our supply chain guys get so much value from who's where, what's what roads are open, what roads are not open, how do we get stuff down there? And if they didn't have that ability to have that large scale conversation, it's really important. It's not just about what we're doing, it's about how do we do it together. So a little bit more blunt, but what Anna said.
I was also going to say something similar. I know a lot of the NGOs are definitely already starting to kind of have this conversation around, medical teams and what that looks like post-disaster, because oftentimes the first group on the ground is the one that gets the funding and all of the information. And so, how do we better work together? And I really think a lot of that can be, in what we do every day, a larger community of practice that maybe involves FEMA and, some of the other organizations. It's kind of why PQMD exists. How do you continue those conversations so that when you go into the field for response, it's not, oh, now we're starting from scratch for this response with our communication. It's just a continuance of what you do on a regular basis with those groups. And it doesn't have to seem like a new activity that you're adding to your very long list of things that you have to do when a disaster happens. It's really just kind of continuing what you're already doing and taking those lessons learned, the same way that we move from response into recovery back into preparedness, there are cycles of lessons learned. You carry out your activities, you have those lessons learned, you do after action reviews, but let's start sharing those in a bigger community of practice. Let's start implementing better ways to do things, or highlighting things, especially bluntly, Kip, as we need, learn to grow together and kind of help us grow together, so that when the next disaster happens and we are trying to coordinate and communicate better, that hopefully we are taking some of what we discussed, and if everyone is part of that, seat at the table, that they're really able to provide that input, but also learn from it. And how are we kind of ensuring that's still happening? There's not an overarching governing force saying you all must talk to each other. It's just kind of on the teams, and a lot of times it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. And I think it's just kind of depends on location, severity of the impact, who has maybe programming there, what the individual mission of the organization is, and kind of how that plays out and what the needs are. But, we really could come together in a little bit more of a holistic picture. And I think the more work we put in before a disaster, the same way we prepare for everything, the same way we have our readiness platforms, we could hopefully carry it out in a better and a stronger way when we need to.
Thank you. Thank you, Betsy. Well, with that, on behalf of PQMD, I just want to say thank you to everyone, our panelists, everyone for joining in on the conversation. We definitely be brainstorming the next future pillar talks. So please follow up with us on our community of practice for the recording and to continue the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye-bye. Take care.
Take care.
Thank
Thank you.